Well, hello, welcome back. So, this is episode 13 of Talk ADHD. This episode is all about ADHD, autism, and how and when they co-occur together. So, the conversation isn't going to be a clinical lecture. We're not going to go too into the detail, but we're going to try and mix the clinical understanding and the knowledge we've gained from research with some practical day-to-day tips and maybe a change in perception about information and the way we see it delivered online. I used to think of these as separate conditions. You were either going to seek diagnosis for ADHD or autism, and the two were never going to occur together, right? Clearly, in recent times, understanding has changed, and we know that's not the case anymore. So, for you as a clinician, what are the challenges you perhaps face in diagnosing adults who you think are showing symptoms of both ADHD and autism?
So that as with so many of these things, has been a journey. It's really, when you're starting out as an ADHD clinician, you're very much focused on those 18 symptoms of ADHD. You're taught about how the developmental history evolves, and not so much about co-occurring conditions and potential differential diagnoses, because there's enough to be wrapping your head around with those 18 symptoms and how they sort of map out across a person's life. So early in my ADHD career, I wasn't as aware as I am now. And it was, I think back then, it was easier to because the understanding hadn't evolved, it was easier to get away with ignoring the autism in an ADHD assessment. And I think it's become borderline impossible now to ignore social and communication difficulties, sensory processing issues that come up in an ADHD assessment. And that's absolutely right. We shouldn't be ignoring those traits. So the diagnostic challenge really is how much focus does a clinician give to those coexisting features when their job is to say, does this person have ADHD or not? Sidestepping that comment, an interesting thing came up as we were setting up Divergence. We were going to be an ADHD service. And then we did a public consultation, and it was an absolutely resounding, you can't just do ADHD as a service. We need a service that will also address a need for autism diagnostics. And that came from the experience of lots and lots, particularly parents of children who were sitting on a waiting list for either condition for a long, long time, going to see someone for their whichever assessment it was and being told that it was the other one, and how frustrating that is to then go and join the back of another queue. So I think as services evolve, and we're starting to see this, we're starting to see that dovetailing of understanding that it could be either. And that is a really important point to make when we're talking about autism. They can co-occur, and quite often do co-occur, but they can look like each other as well. So it's quite a complex thing to tease out. And it comes back, Matt, to this thing that we've talked about before, about the limitations of medicine and the classification of disorders that we work with. The issue is that there are clusters of symptoms attributed to both diagnoses. So with ADHD, we have inattentive symptoms, we have hyperactive symptoms, impulsivity. And with autistic spectrum, we have social communication difficulties, sensory processing difficulties, and some other bits and bobs that sit in the diagnostic criteria. Well, they're like oil and water, those two lists. They don't sit together. There isn't an overlap, and that's intentional as part of the the diagnostic classification. We don't want that overlap. We want to be specific in describing something and making that a diagnosis. But people aren't like that. It is a spectrum, and it's possible for someone with ADHD to present with autistic traits. And they may not meet the criteria for a diagnosis of autism, but they have those traits. Equally, the other way around, someone living with autism may have difficulties with attention. They may have hyperactive features as well, but not meet the criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD. So there is a spectrum, and there is a sort of a blurry line between the two conditions. They're not entirely separate, but they're defined separately in order to make the classification more straightforward and to make the diagnostic process more reliable. So the challenge really comes from the approach, doesn't it?
Yeah. In terms of that approach, do you ever see a point where that changes? Where instead of them being deliberately separated, it becomes look, this is too commonly co-occurring to ignore, so let's just look at it as a whole, as an ADHD ASD piece. And
it's yeah, I think it extends beyond that. It extends to brains develop differently, and there are patterns to those differences. So I wouldn't be saying that that's just about autism and ADHD. I would include other neurodevelopmental issues as well. So dyslexia, dyscalculia, Tourette's even. Brains are developing, and different bits develop at different rates in different heads. And that can look like one of these diagnoses of what we call a neurodevelopmental disorder. And I think an experienced clinician will have all of that in mind and be thinking about those overlaps and that those blurred boundaries, because in order to make a diagnosis of ADHD, remember that when we did the assessment podcast, we talked about that criteria E can't be better explained by another mental disorder. And at those blurry boundaries, it becomes really important that you can make that decision. Which is it? Yeah. Which is causing this particular feature? Because it could be the difference between a diagnosis of either or not. But that doesn't change the experience of the person who's living with those clusters of symptoms that are defined in a book. That's someone's life. So that's the diagnostic challenge. Is we have all of these discrete diagnoses, which are really helpful in organizing things for planning out how to help people. But actually, how helpful is that to the person who's living with those difficulties, those challenges, those differences?
It's on to then, as a next question, in your experience, given everything you've just said, are there more effective approaches or strategies that you've now developed for the treatment of, and I'm particularly thinking adults at the moment, of adults who have both ADHD and autism? And is it a case of very tailored approaches to their treatment and care?
I think there are some overarching themes. So nothing of what I'm going to say is an absolute, but there are themes that you, as a clinician, can use to guide your practice. So I have a different approach where there is an established diagnosis, or I'm seeing lots of traits. I will prescribe differently for someone diagnosed with ADHD where I see those traits, and certainly where I see that diagnosis. Because in the absence of social communication difficulties, sensory processing difficulties, we can be more assertive in treatment, in prescribing. So a lot of services will ramp up doses of medication, and for those who have ADHD but no other neurodevelopmental difficulty, that's reasonably tolerable. However, it's quite a significant change, the impact of medication. And if it's not managed, that change, even though it's exactly what you're aiming for in that improvement in focus, concentration, can be so overwhelming that people say, well, these tablets aren't working. I don't want those. I don't like that. Yet it's exactly what we were aiming for. So it's usual for me to be a little bit more cautious in dose increases where there are co-occurring ADHD and autistic features. One of the things I've noted is there tends to be, and it's not always the case again, there tends to be more sensitivity to the effects. So it takes less medication, a lower dose of medication, where ADHD and autism coexist. Now, please don't say, well, I've got someone who's taking the full dose, the maximum dose, and they have both. That's quite likely. But as a rule, as a trend, I see you're needing less to see the effects that you're looking for. Moving along from that, actually, sometimes I find I have to dial back the dose because it's too good. So this can relate to the pharmacology that we've talked about as well. So I tend to find that methylphenidate's better tolerated in autism, not always again, but usually, and that's about that difference in the pharmacological action of dexamphetamine as compared to methylphenidate. I know in my family there are exceptions to that rule, but there are also people who very clearly do respond to that rule. So I would tend to aim more for methylphenidate where there are coexisting features of autism because it's pharmacologically, I suppose, less intrusive is the best way of describing it. It's not pushing out that extra dopamine. It's regulating the dopamine that's already been naturally released. The pitfalls with that are the rate at which methylphenidate's cleared out. So immediate release methylphenidate is in your system, but it's effective for 3 or 4 hours. So it's very difficult to get that stability of effect if you're using immediate release methylphenidate, which then leads to these peaks and troughs of effects. Even if they're in someone without autism, they wouldn't be that disruptive. It's enough of a change across the day to give that instability and that sort of sense of uncertainty of what's happening with your focus and concentration as it varies, as the dose you've just taken starts to fade away again, and then you introduce another one and up you go again. So it can feel like a roller coaster taking immediate release methylphenidate when you've also living with autistic features. However, that works for some people. So it's about understanding the person that you're prescribing for is the best way. So taking time before you rush in with, the NICE guidelines say we should do this first, taking time to understand that. So before the NICE guidelines were published, I used to worry that I was prescribing a particular stimulant too much and I was being influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. And I did an audit of my prescribing practice and I found that I was prescribing more non-stimulants back in the days when there wasn't anybody to tell us which was the best. And I found particularly that non-stimulants in coexisting autism provide a level of stability that is comfortable. So it becomes this trade-off between increasing focus and concentration against stability, but also there's needing to consider the balance of that and the desirability of having that much focus and concentration when you're not used to it all the time. So it is an issue that really needs to be considering what someone is looking for. It's not just about following the guidelines and the algorithm that we're told you prescribe this first, then this, then this. It becomes more of a conversation about what is it that you're actually looking for, because I might deliver that and it might completely overwhelm you. And actually what you're asking for isn't what you want.
Yeah, and I think what I'm getting from that, and certainly, my experience of the way your practice is, the relationship between the person that you're treating and you as a clinician from the get-go, and the exchange of information is vital. So questions like, what do you want it to do? What do you think it's doing? When does it wear off? All of those things. And I've personally experienced changes recently, and it's really important to share that with, I think, your clinician, whoever that is, to say, I thought it was going to do, it seems to be doing this, and this is how it feels. Because it goes back to something you said in episode 1. You're an expert in ADHD, but the person is an expert in themselves. You can't know, you can't guess. They have to give you that information for you to then adjust. Which, though, leads me to this. Anyone can go online and look for information about ADHD and autism. Frequently do. There are many, many different people, different voices talking about it, which, for the most part is great. But do you think we're at a point where there are some common misconceptions about the coexistence of ADHD and autism? Do people come in armed with information, let's call it that you feel you have to address?
I don't think they do. I think the idea of separateness it still exists in society, that ADHD is ADHD and autism is autism, and they're two totally different things. And if you go to an ADHD support service, then why would you go to an autism support service? Well, you might go to both, and for different reasons. So I think the thing that shocks people most is about the diversity of that spectrum, or those spectra. Really, it's not just that spectrum, is it? It's that there are so many flavors of both diagnosis that I think people are often shocked. So what stands out more in my clinical practice, and that comes to mind now, is how many people are shocked when they come for one diagnosis and we say, have you considered these features of this as well? And they're shocked that someone would see that and say, well, it might be something else, or it might be both, because they'd worked out already that it was what they thought it was. And actually the understanding of what these diagnoses mean has a long way to go. But so much so that there isn't that wider social understanding of how the two diagnoses invariably dance together.
No, there's not. I think you're right. And I think that goes back to, again, for me, I see a lot of information on social media, and I see, things posted that are absolutely, this is ADHD. We are talking ADHD, and I sit there and go, are you sure though? Because what I think that's describing.
Yeah. So the big one, the big one there is So the big one there is people living with ADHD have sensory processing difficulties, and lots. I do. I remember refusing to wear certain clothes when I was little because they felt wrong and they scratched, and actually got eczema on my skin as a result of how much certain fabrics scratched on my skin. But I'm still not diagnosed autistic even now. I recognise some traits, but and those vary whether or not I'm medicated. So
it's
really tricky.
I think that's the important thing.
It's how far down.
Listen, this is what.
It's how far down that journey of using a label to describe yourself you're willing to go. I think it's there's this need for us to have a diagnostic understanding of these clusters of features of who we are and how we are. That sort of is dehumanizing it a bit, I think. And
Yeah, I agree.
we look for these labels. I've talked with you off air about my struggles with the label of RSD. Now, I'm not saying
Mm,
RSD isn't a thing, but do we need to call it RSD?
mm,
You know,
yeah. Or is it a feature?
yeah, it's understandable that we're sensitive to rejection because we've lived with it so often because people don't understand who we are and how we are. But do we need to label that? I don't know. That's a debate that goes on.
No. What interesting is, you lead me on to another question in my head then, which is thinking about that and that definition, do we need those labels? How do you think ADHD and autism, either individually or together, and I guess we're talking more together here, impact on sort of the daily life and functioning of adults? And is that better looked at as I am a person struggling with these things, or from a medical model of, well, the 18 diagnostic criteria of ADHD say it's RSD, for example?
I think the diagnostic criteria in general serve a better purpose externally to the person, whereas the understanding of the symptoms is more of an internal thing. So that what I mean by that is a diagnosis allows access to external supports and understanding from others. Having the label, it gives you that it's having the badge, isn't it, or the T-shirt that says this is me, so I don't have to tell you who I am. You know, I like this band because I'm wearing
Yeah.
this band's T-shirt. But
Yeah.
To carry on that metaphor, it doesn't say why I like this band. It's just I've just got the label on there. But they may have one particular song that really resonates with me, and actually I don't like the rest of their back catalogue. But this one song was so important to me at the
Yeah.
time. So that bit of it. So the reason why I like the band is more internal. It's more about me and how I feel internally, and I think we trade off the external benefits to seek these diagnoses so that we can better define ourselves in the world. But actually, the trade off there is we lose connection with who we are.
Yes.
Does that comment, as I'm saying that, is that a comment of someone who is very bloody late diagnosed? You know, that actually I lived for 45 years thinking I had a normally developed brain, a typically developed brain, and that I was, it wasn't anything to do with how I am, that I was exhausted at the end of the working day and had to sleep. That was just
Yeah.
me and how I was. Now I've got this diagnosis and these medications that mean I don't need to do that anymore because I can be more focused through the daytime and not have to juggle all of this stuff in my head. Well, not as much. So my understanding of the internal stuff has been changed because I've got the ADHD T-shirt.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm still the me I was before anybody gave me that T-shirt, and I still, on days where I haven't had medication, sometimes get overwhelmed with how much goes on in my head. I was shouting at my head this morning in the Asda car park, just
Yeah.
shut up, because my meds hadn't started working. I'd had a particularly busy start to the day, so I was up and running before the medication was, and because I've got the experience of being medicated, it wasn't there for me when I needed it yet because it
No.
hadn't started working. But there I was going to pick up the shopping, and I was burbling away in the car, driving along, chattering and singing songs and shouting and doing voices, and I just, shut up. Where before I had the diagnosis, I would just, there I go again.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's just, that's it. It's interesting, though, hearing you as a clinician describe it like that, for me, is fascinating.
Why?
And well, let me explain, right? As a layperson, not a clinician, not an anything, right? Just somebody who's interested. Hearing you, who has that very deep, rich clinical knowledge and understanding of diagnosis, say quite openly that you spent however long in the car going to Asda, coming back from it, shouting at your head, right, because it was too noisy, I think is really important, because there is it goes back to what you said about what does a diagnosis do, and this is something that I really got from Mandy Orlack we recorded with her the episode on the law. The clinical side of things, in terms of, for example, educational work, they are pieces of information that we can take to people, and they are used to remove any disadvantage that we have in those settings to help us thrive. That's it. That's all that information does at that point, is gives us information to say, I struggle here. If this happened, perhaps I wouldn't. But like you said about being a person, it does not in any way say, by the way, when my brain's going a million miles an hour, I'm going to come off like, you know, I'm losing the plot. If somebody drove past me in the car, they might think, all right, what's he had?
Yeah.
Right? There's importance in that. There's importance in the fact that there is a very human element to having ADHD and autism, or either or. There is a very human element in knowing what it means to you. And this brings me on to a topic that I'm talking about an awful lot at the moment, that I'm very passionate about. In the same vein, that information about you tells you about one person and one person only, you. It does not, it cannot, and nobody is able to speak globally on behalf of everyone with, right? And I again, it's something I see an awful lot. And the phrase I started to use, in fact, somebody used it on my behalf, which really took me back last year, was they called me, potentially me, the missing middle of the conversation. And I'm missing, hold on. I'm not missing anything. What do you want about? But what was framed to me was, because you don't look like anything, whatever looking autistic, looking ADHD looks like, right? It would be easy to see you in a workplace and see you babbling on, shouting at your head, looking frustrated, and just think, pull it together, Matt. Sort it out. Because I don't look like, I haven't got stamps on either hand going ADHD and autism. By the way, that's why I'm doing right.
Mm.
And they said that must be very hard to constantly justify, to constantly explain. Well, funnily enough, I don't. I mean, professionally, yes, I talk about it a lot, but I don't wave it about at everyone. And I think it's interesting because I now can look at my own sons, right? And at least one of them. My youngest, particularly for me, the older he's got, has begun to, the word I'll use is present more autistic traits and challenges than he did when he was younger. Because when he was younger, it came across as quite kooky, quirky, kind of cute.
Mm-hmm.
We used to call him the little professor. Now we've got this 6'3", 18-year-old who can be racked with anxiety, very nervous, feels very isolated, only has 2 friends in the world that he talks to, only sees them in person once a month, and he's struggling with his place in life. And he's not big on social media, interestingly, he can't stand it. But when I show him things that are being said about both ADHD and autism online and say, does that relate to you? His answer is always, it's not even close. I don't even recognize any of that. None of that is me. None of that feels right. Right. And I think that's because, for me, what we're seeing more is either ends of that spectrum, right? And I don't like it thinking of it as a linear rainbow analogy, but in this case, it's easier. We're either seeing people who are coping much better outwardly. So whilst they may have challenges, they're able to present in a much more together way and have the job and do the speeches and all that brings. And then we're aware of the other end of the spectrum, people who are severely impacted verbally, physically, cognitively, who will always need care in one way or another, right? But what we don't see is the middle. We don't see the kids like my son, who, like me, don't look particularly anything, but within 3 minutes of being with him, you'd go, oh, wow, okay, I'm not sure what is this? I'm not sure what's going on here. Why is this conversation so challenging? Why is it so difficult? And that conversation for me, that missing middle not being discussed, is really quite harmful, because there are more people in that missing middle than I think people realize.
That's where the majority are. That's where the majority are,
Right,
Matt.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So there are more adults, I believe, who've, like you said, 45 years, gone through life thinking this is typical, this is normal, this is okay, and then gone, oh, that's why, right? I think there are more people, and we spoke off air about this. There are lots of professions where I think this is far more prevalent than people would like to imagine, right? Where there are people who, behind their four walls, are struggling with life, with everything. But when they get into their role, because it suits their way of thinking, they're incredible. And yeah, all right, I'm going to throw things out here, and feel free for people to tell me otherwise. But the amount of people in law, the amount of people in finance, right? The amount of people in sort of the justice profession in any way, shape or form, who present really clearly when you speak to them with autism particularly, and ADHD, right? The amount of phenomenal defense barristers and lawyers who are screamingly ADHD and autistic because it suits their role, because they love the detail of a case, and they'll verbally run rings around someone and be right?
Yep.
And yet, if you go home, the house is a mess, the flat's a mess, the car's a mess, they're forgetting to eat, they're forgetting to shower, they need someone to do. Those are the voices that aren't being spoken about. And the less we speak about them, and the more we only see the very together, very with it people, even if they say, oh, but I struggle too, I'm sure they do. But the danger is if those at that end are saying, I speak for everyone, there's an issue. There's an issue that means the people in the middle don't get their voice. They don't get their say. And for me, this understanding of ADHD and autism is that missing middle is important. There is no one presentation of either of these things.
There's not. So there's 504 presentations of ADHD, and that's just in the combinations of the symptoms. Okay, that's 504 different ways that you can meet the symptom criteria of ADHD and be impaired by those combinations. Then, if you look at the autistic spectrum, which is by its definition blurry, the diagnostic process, which I'm qualified to do, is very, very blurry, and it involves a lot of subtle observation and is challenging. So and then you combine those two and multiply that out. Of course, we're all different, and no one person speaks for everyone. That isn't ever the case. You can have two people, with one person being the spokesman. The other person's views won't be represented the same way, and that's not two people with a neurodivergent diagnosis. That's just any two people. There are differences, and those differences are important. And the more we say ADHD is this or autism is this, the more we marginalize people. And whether they're in the middle or they're at the edge, I don't mind. But what we need to do is open up this conversation about diversity and difference. But that, yes, some of those differences are defined in clusters by these things called diagnoses. But my diagnosis of ADHD, which I still struggle with, we've talked before on the podcast about this, the concept of me being disabled. But, driving through that car park this morning, I think anybody would have said I was disabled. Because, if I think the police had been going the other way, they would have pulled me over. Because it was a bit like Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam. It was that sort of energy in the morning, and just and that was just one bit. But where the disability came in this morning was that crushing realization that I just needed it to shut up so that I could drive the car around that corner without crashing it. But that was my ADHD this morning, and it's very different on different days. Do you know my response to my medication is different on different days, depending on all of these other factors. So the idea of individuality and diversity together is a really important one. Not putting too much store in diagnosis. As Mandy said, it is a means to an end. It isn't a definition of who you are. And anybody who says that it is seriously selling themselves short because they've lost themselves in their diagnosis, in my view.
Yes.
Well, that got a bit heated and a bit strong, a bit quick, but that's how I feel about it. It's so
true.
easy to lose yourself in a label.
I think I will take this a step further, right? I see it so often with people who are newly diagnosed within maybe the first couple of 3 years, and I speak about this a lot, it almost becomes vitriolic about how much you want people to know. But it's fascinating. In that period, I hear more people define themselves by the label than they do as a person with a condition. Right? The amount of that period, people in that period who are my ADHD, my autism, not I'm Steve and, right? It's fascinating. And then when we get to a level of our own acceptance, that tends to start dying down a bit, and we go, actually, hold on a minute, it's different. But right, so let's think about research in this conversation then. When we think research, traditionally, we think clinical, we think statistical, mathematical data, longitudinal studies. Are we at a point where the recognition of lived experience and the data that gives us is as important in that research piece now?
Yes. And it does follow on from what we're saying. So this sits in the sort of social perceptions of what research means, and we're taught that a randomized control trial is the gold standard. That's how you define something. You have a control group and see the differences, and that is very what's defined as quantitative in its approach, and the qualitative approach to research, which is talking to people and gathering data about the spread of certain phenomena across a sample group and analysing that. I think it's always been the poor cousin in research methods, but it can bring up some really rich insights into how so my research background has always been qualitative rather than quantitative, because I suppose that's the kind of guy I am. I like to look at the subtleties and not really get into that reductionist approach to it's this because when it's not like that then this happens. It's more understanding and evolving concepts. There's lots of that research, and it tends to be sort of driven by more psychologically minded folk than medically minded folk, because there is more qualitative research in psychology than there is in medicine. Medicine is founded on that quantitative approach, that reduction, because it makes it easier to process the data. Whereas if you talk about complex ideas with people, you get really, really rich data, but it's very difficult to process. But I think nursing research, psychology research has a lot to play. I gave a talk about this last year, the importance of nursing research in progressing the understanding of this phenomenon that is classified by medicine as a neurodevelopmental disorder. Actually, the sorts of things we've talked about today, and that the humanity of it, there's a great role to play in psychological and nursing research and other, social work, occupational therapy research, where the people with lived experience doing that research, and not necessarily just contributing to it, but actually doing it, because they bring, or we bring, our insights in a different way. I think differently than someone who doesn't have ADHD. I've become more and more aware of that since diagnosis.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, I'm sort of almost bringing this to a close because I think it's a really important discussion with a lot of points. I guess very briefly, if we think about those adults with ADHD and autism, and we talk about support or strategies in line with medication. So, if we're over ADHD, we know medication is known to be, right, the most effective for most people. Is this another point where the likes of mentors or peer support or support groups becomes really important for people? That finding their tribe and connecting with people who they go, oh, I do that as well. Do you think that's where those kind of support strategies have their place?
I think that's you've summarized it beautifully in what you've said throughout this podcast, in that there is a journey. You're diagnosed, you get this label, finally, the T-shirt that fits me, that works, that describes how I am, is the beginning. And yes, medications can help with that. And where there is a coexisting autism spectrum condition, that has to be done with sensitivity to that condition, as well as the attention and hyperactivity. That is then the beginning of the next phase of that journey, which is having got this new understanding, this new model of who I am. How do I then take that out into the world? And that's where mentoring comes in, because someone who's gone before can say, well, there are these different routes. Which do you think would work for you? Coaching, similar, more inductive. Fair enough. Yeah. But that again is about, okay, this is where you are. Where do you want to be? How do you get there? And is that not the very thing that you need at the start of a journey? Like, you are not the person you thought you were. That these letters that have been attached to your medical records now define a different way of being that could, if you can align yourself to that, you can make a more productive and valuable, and I mean productive for yourself and valuable to yourself, progress along your journey in life. It's no more important to have those where there's coexisting autism spectrum conditions. I don't think that. The sensitivity comes in the prescribing of the drugs, I think, where ADHD and autism coexist. And then once that's got right, it's the same process. Yes, the journey might be different, and it's individual, but once that process of prescribing and closing off that medical pathway, and okay, this is now you with defined differently with a different tool that helps you focus and concentrate, that might make you feel more awkward in social situations because you're less distractible, less likely to be impulsive. So you feel more awkward and more bare because you're more aware of social cues than you might have been before, and then completely disoriented by them. But once you've got that foundation of an effective ADHD treatment where there are the conditions coexist, it's the same journey of, okay, this is me. How do I take that first step of this new me? So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I will add to this. I there was a question I saw online about, when looking for a mentor or a coach, what advice will you give? And I will say this at this point. For me, if I was newly diagnosed with anything and I was looking for mentorship or coach, there are a number of real simple things I would want to know. So the first one, mostly because I like research and I like people who've studied, is okay, how long have you been actually learning about this, researching it? How much knowledge have you gathered about this topic that you profess to be able to help me with? That's number one, right? Number two, after that would be, do you have this yourself? And if you do, if you are ADHD, if you are autistic, when were you diagnosed? And kind of stepping back, before you were diagnosed, had you done any research on this? Had you looked into this in terms of helping people with before your own diagnosis? Or have you realized you were it and gone, now I understand it and I shall now help you, which is fine, but it's different, right? The knowledge level is different. Even if you've been a coach in a different sphere before, it's different. And then the other one that I always ask, no matter who I'm going to work with, how many people have you helped? How many people have you spoken to about this? How many people have you understood? And do you understand different presentations, different experiences? Those questions to me fundamentally would tell me whether that person has got the breadth and the depth of knowledge, as well as the ability to mentor or coach me. And if any of them are a no, for me, it would be, okay, I don't think you'll be the person for me. Look, you might be the loveliest person in the world, but if you can't show me that, I'm sorry, the likelihood is you don't know any more than me.
Yeah,
Now,
so
that doesn't
there's
work for me.
counter argument to that the process is the process, and you don't need to understand the individual and their experience to be able to guide them through the process. And a good coach can, to a certain degree, do that if they're doing coaching the way coaching should be done. And therein is the rub, isn't it? Because if you come to coaching thinking, well, I've mastered my ADHD, now I can teach you how to master it like I did, you won't ever succeed, because it isn't about how you did your conquering of ADHD. It's how I am going to do mine.
Yeah.
And you may have some
do?
experience that's valuable to help me along my journey. Don't go that way, don't go that. Yep, great. But if you haven't got the humility to be able to stand back and support me to find my next step and my sure foot along the journey, and you're bringing your own experience, then that shows that is potentially quite dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Because the step that one person made along a journey might not be right for a different person, because they may go off balance where the person, it's an individualized thing. So yes, a coach without understanding can, I don't think it's preferable, but they are able to, so long as they do coaching, as defined, which is more than mentoring, because you've got lived experience. There's a process to it, so it's aligned to things like cognitive behavioral therapy. So back in the day when I was first training, cognitive behavioral therapy was relatively new, and it was a process. It's evolved in the 30 years I've been nursing, but it was. I still remember it because it was so outstandingly shocking, that the idea that you didn't need to know someone's journey into depression in order to support them out of it was quite groundbreaking. And the pure cognitive behavioralists back in the 90s were very focused on very targeted interventions that didn't need, and that's what was revolutionary about cognitive behavioral therapy. You didn't need that psychotherapeutic analytical approach. You could just be solution focused and target your intervention. So yeah, I think you're right in what you're saying about, choose the person that resonates with you. But equally, yes, I would say choose someone who has some degree of understanding of the limitations of their practice. If someone says, I've got the solution to everybody's ADHD, then I certainly haven't. I don't think I've even got the solution to mine, Matt. Never mind anybody else's. But I know some stuff about it, and I can guide people best I can. And what else? There was something else came up when you were talking. I can't recall it now. There's another pearl.
Well, I tell you what, let's see if it comes back. Just to close this off, there are a group of people we need to talk about in this conversation, right? We're talking about the person with those diagnoses, ADHD, autism, and the challenges and the difficulties that may present with that new information. I think the people that often get forgotten at the outset is the families, the partners, the spouses, the children, if we're talking about adults, right? So I'll ask you the question and I'll give you my answer as well. What do you think is a good approach in discussing your challenges that ADHD or autism may present to you in a way that supports your family and helps them support you?
It's about being vulnerable, I think. That's the challenge. We live in a society of shoulds. I should do this, I should do that. I shouldn't drive around the car park doing a Robin Williams at 8:30 in the morning after I've dropped the kid off at school. But I did. So there are all these expectations, be that from an employer, be that from a university, and if you're living with these conditions, if you can't share that vulnerability that the educators, the society out there, those external people, are challenging you and hurting you, then people can't help. But equally, the other side of that is knowing and having that confidence that the family are going to be receptive to that and aren't going to launch in rescue mode. So it's about evolving a relationship of being vulnerable and allowing people to support you, but also only people that can be trusted to support you. And that can be difficult to navigate whilst you're also sort of unwrangling all of these challenges you've had all of your life. But that vulnerability, I think, is absolutely key. That you don't have to have all the answers, and your family don't have to have all the answers. They can just care, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just that little light tap on the hand or a stroke of the back of the hand in a tense situation can just snap it all back and, okay, they're with me, that's all right. And so, it is difficult, but care about one another and be cared for.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I completely agree with that. Often what I say to people in mentoring at this point is just let your family know that they don't need to be experts. They don't need to have all the knowledge, all the information. They don't need to read the textbooks, go down the rabbit hole, watch the videos. They don't need that. They need to remember, as we've said throughout this, that you are still you. You just have some new information about what makes you the way you are, makes you behave the way you behave, think the way you think, etc. And with that new information for you may come some questions, and it may challenge you, it may stimulate you. And again, it's that nurture thing being held. As long as they are there to understand that you're learning and so are they, that's the best support that you can have, because it's about, nobody wants to be seen as a problem to be fixed, let alone in your family, right? Nobody wants to feel like, oh, I'm a problem, right? Or I'm a burden. So if your family is just there going, okay, this is big, we get it. What do you need? That's a fantastic starting point. You'll all learn together. You'll all accumulate information as you go. You don't need it from the day of your awareness or diagnosis, because if you try, you end up with one or all of you burnt out, overwhelmed, and then no one can support anyone. And I've seen that too many times.
Do you know? I think that's that. Yeah, that you've just said just summarizes every single theme we've looked at in the podcast. That people are looking for the answer, the solution, and sometimes that's the wrong question. Sometimes just being vulnerable and being there for one another, and we see this in the WhatsApp community, don't we? There is,
Yeah.
and I felt it myself. There's times where I've put stuff on there, and it's just because I've just needed to connect, and it hasn't been sort of conscious. Oh, I need. It's just that,
No.
and I'll comment at times, and having people there that just say, "Yeah, that's shit," it really helps.
Yeah.
Don't need any
Simple,
answers.
isn't it,
I don't
really?
need solutions. I just need
No.
people to go, yeah, isn't it?
Yeah. It's exactly that. Yeah.
So
It's,
whether
it is
it's
about
searching
recognising
for, whether you're searching for, which mushroom is going to be the best one to sort something out, or which medication, or which diagnosis, or which coach, actually sometimes just being human and acknowledging that life can be hard is really, really one of the most powerful supports anybody can have, be they living with ADHD, autism, or ingrowing toenails. Being human is challenging sometimes, but we are creatures that depend on one another. That's the secret of humanity's success, that we can work together.
Yeah.
But that requires vulnerability, and that requires tolerance of difference as well.
It does. Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does. And
well, we got deeply philosophical there towards the end.
We did, didn't we? We did, right. So
yeah.
How'd you pull out of that one? I don't think we do. Listen, I will just close this off by saying this, folks. Talking about autism and ADHD together is never going to be easy. It's not a subject that's to be sugar-coated, skirted over. And as I said at the start, this wasn't to be a clinical learn. But I hope that what you've got from it, that I have in having this conversation, is that the most important part, whether it's one, both, whatever it is you are still you with just some new information. Your role, your aim should be, how do you become comfortable with you and this new information? How do you help other people understand what that means for you in different circumstances? And that isn't about anything else than spending some time just paying attention to how you respond to things, why you respond to them, finding what support you need, where you need it, when you need it. And then my honest, firm belief through all the people I've supported over all the years is, if that's the process, if that's the aim, the results are far better. Typically, the results are far better. So be you with extra information, and hopefully everything will be good. And if you want to join the community, the link to it will be in the show notes. It'll be the very last link in the show notes, so it's easy to find. But for now, that was episode 13. Not unlucky at all, as far as I'm concerned. And we will see you next Thursday for another episode. But Andrew, I think that's time for a well-earned cup of tea. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you too. And I look forward to talking more about autism, because I don't think we got anywhere near finished with that topic. But definitely an interesting conversation.
We will revisit.
Thanks everybody for listening.